Book 6, Chapter 1. There are various legends in existence as to Ambrose Meyrick's famous last term at Lupton. As has been seen, Palmer, an honest man if a booby, was completely thunderstruck by the catastrophe. Indeed, he used to quote Horace's account of his conversion with reference to the manner of Ambrose's passing from the bonds and bounds of the dear old school. He, it is evident enough from the record that he has left of the affair, saw nothing and suspected nothing of what was to come. But naturally enough, others, quite as stupid as he, but less honest, were ready to affirm, after the event, that they had suspicions for some time that there was something wrong with the fellow. This, of course, is nonsense. The Luptonians, masters and boys alike, were no more capable of descrying the growth of a new life and a new joy and a new ecstasy in Ambrose than if they had been a kennel of Newfoundland puppies. You cannot drink Old Tom and 4-ale all your days, and then become at short notice, or at no notice, an expert in the finer growths of the Medoc. And if your mind is given up to rocker and sticker, the misunderstanding of the Latin and Greek literatures, and the doctor's sermons, you are not very likely to discern spiritual things or the presence of the hosts of the Lord. It was all nonsense. They saw nothing, or if they saw that Meyrick was looking very fit and pleased with himself, they thought it natural enough in view of his achievements and his prospects. The truthful, though idiotic, Palmer mentions in his account that Chesson had been rather annoyed with a certain essay sent in by Meyrick. Perhaps even he rather exaggerates this incident in the light of after-knowledge. The truth is that the head had given a kind of lecture to the sixth and had asked the boys to let him have by way of logical exercise an essay. The subject was at the choice of the writer, in which similar methods of argument should be used. Meyrick sent him in, as he readily confessed, by far the best essay, only it was devoted, by the way, to a satirical refutation of the matter of the doctor's lecture. Original writing on any subject was not a strong point with the sixth at Lupton. The other boys had taken profuse notes of the lecture and had reproduced it with more or less success. This, as the doctor said, was not in the least what he had asked for, and he complimented Meyrick on having been the only one in the form to see the point of the exercise. "But," as he said, "I must say that I am sorry for one thing. It is not that I gather from your essay that you do me the honor to disagree with me. Opinions are matters of very little consequence, so long as they are not held with any spirit of conviction. Never be bitterly certain about anything. You will only make yourself ridiculous. But what I want to say is this. If you want to get on in life, if you like it better, I will say, if you want to employ for the advantage of your fellow men the talents that have been given you by God, if you want to use your life, remember one thing. Renounce irony. Now the whole of this ludus of yours is permeated by irony. In a thing like this, it doesn't matter. It goes no farther than my desk. But when you once come before the world, a false step may be fatal. You may take it from me that the precipice of irony is of all the most fatal and final. Go over that, and you are smashed once and for all. You see, Meyrick, I am talking to you as one reasonable being to another. You have read a good deal. Just think of a few great satirists of literature, and of what happened to them. Dryden could not keep out William of Orange, or Shadwell, or Nahum Tate. Rabelais just escaped the bonfire. Swift's Tale of a Tub is a wonderful piece of satire. You know what Swift's end was like. Above all, think of Swift. I dare say you've read Thackeray on Swift. You may be as satirical as you please if you follow Thackeray's methods, not those of the man he disliked so heartily. So long as you give the world sugar plums, you may add a slightly acid coating. People like it. You see, the other course is so entirely futile. You are smashed, as I say. Suppose you reply that you don't care, that you are willing to be martyred for a good cause. But the point is that the good cause is ruined with you, and very often because of you. You must see yourself that your case is bound to suffer if you begin your speech by letting the jury know that you consider them a pack of fools. Just think it over, Meyrick, will you? The lecture on which the essays were to be written was a brief analysis of superstition and superstitious beliefs. Chesson had run through the various arguments by which, as he said, the superstitiously inclined generally defend foolish beliefs and more foolish practices. He pointed out that there was the appeal to universal or very general usage, to great names as sanctioning absurd practice and dogma, to results supposed to have been achieved, imaginary cures, for example, to antiquity, to a strong feeling of necessity, etc., etc. Then he showed how profoundly irrational most superstitions were. There was usually no connection between the supposed cause and the supposed effect, and he drew the attention of the boys to the fact that when the outworks of a system of thought were confessedly ridiculous, there was no reason to suspect that the central dogmas were in the same case, since the one derives from the other. Thus, he said, from the manifest folly and immorality of many of the Catholic miracles, so-called, we may legitimately enough draw conclusions far from favorable to the whole Catholic system. In the same way, if you saw a man dancing naked in the street, you would not be very likely to ask his advice on any serious question. Absurdity in externals, in lesser things, probably proceeds from absurdity or madness in great things. The doctor showed, too, that the superstitious habit flourished chiefly amongst ignorant, backward peoples, whose minds were kin to those of children. This, he said, is a weighty argument. If we find a doctrine or a practice commending itself readily enough to immature ages of life, to children, to ages of immature thought, to the Middle Ages, to immature peoples, generally such as Spaniards and southern Italian peasants, while at the same time the doctrine or practice in question would be laughed at by 9 scientific men out of 10, then you are probably right in thinking such a doctrine or practice absurd. The lecture ended by showing that we should at least suspect every system which did not lead to some material benefit. We are more or less children of matter. We have been placed on this material sphere under material conditions. We are justified, then, in demanding that any doctrine proffered for our acceptance shall justify itself materially. If it cannot do this, we have reason to conclude that it is somehow or other out of harmony with the scheme of things to which we belong, that is, that it is false. Compare the state of superstitious savages with the state of Christian England from this point of view. Excluding all higher considerations, the savage as a whole fails materially. He is uncomfortable, while the Englishman is comfortable. Again, compare, still from the same point of view, the condition of an enlightened Protestant operative in some great industrial centre, say in Lupton, with the condition of a superstitious Irish peasant on his bog farm. The same result is given. The English Protestant is much more comfortable than the Irish Roman Catholic. Take a third instance. Think of what a country, a city, a house were like 500 or 600 years ago. And then think of the enormous improvements that have been effected, rapidity and security of transit, creation of sanitation, vast improvement in lighting, etc., etc. For the third time, our method gives the expected result. The modern, free from superstition, is in every way more prosperous materially than his superstitious ancestor who lived before the Reformation. Note the cumulative force of the instances. In each case, superstition is allied with poverty and discomfort, just as a particular microbe produces a particular disease. Ambrose sent in an essay on the folly of eating and drinking. He showed that in the first place it was absurd to defend these ridiculous practices because they were the custom of all, of universal usage. It had once been the universal usage, in civilized states at all events, to hear Mass. It had been the universal usage to believe in witchcraft and omens. Secondly, it was idle to quote the names of great authorities in praise of meat and drink, since great authorities could be cited in favor of the most absurd and the most monstrous beliefs and practices. Then, why allege the apparent benefit received through these insane orgies? There were people even at the present day who were ready to testify to the benefit they had received through bathing in holy wells, through kissing the moldering bones of a dead man, through uttering various irrational formulae called prayers. Once such testimony would have been well nigh universal. In neither case, either of the few moderns or of the many ancients, do we attach the slightest credibility to these reports of apparent benefit. The plea of antiquity was, of course, out of court. It had been advanced in favor of every abuse, of every rank absurdity. If it had been listened to, we should still be in the condition of the Australian blackfellows. It was quite true that men had been eating and drinking for countless ages. They had been committing many other disgusting, irrational, criminal, useless, and offensive actions for countless ages. So far as the argument from antiquity was of any force at all, it was an argument establishing a high degree of probability against the utility of roast beef and beer, walnuts and water. Astrology was as ancient a practice as any of which we have record. Its antiquity is presumption of its absurdity. Then people would say that they felt they must have something to eat and drink. A Chinaman would tell exactly the same story of his opium pipe, an alcoholic maniac of his wine, a habitual smoker of his tobacco. Each of these deluded persons would pretend that he could not live without his stimulant or his narcotic, and would probably suffer severely, for a time, if it were denied him. The vicious craving induced by the habit co-operating with the imagination, so that a very real state of misery would be induced. Yet neither opium, wine, nor tobacco is generally accounted a necessary of life. If we admit the plea of we feel that we must have it, then hypodermic injections of morphia will take their place amongst the simple necessaries of existence. Of course, if the drug maniac is guarded and the drug withheld, he will generally, in the process of time, be cured of his longing, and it is only reasonable to conclude that such would be the experience of the poor slaves of beef and beer, or bread and water. In some cases, the victim of drugs or alcohol turns out to be incurable. Even then, we do not draw the inference that opium and whiskey are necessary to life. Again, there was the supreme mark of irrationality about the processes of eating and drinking. People said they experienced certain sensations which they called by the arbitrary and conventional names of hunger and thirst. They could give no clear account of these supposed sensations, doubtless because they were entirely imaginary, the results of autosuggestion. If you cross-examined one of the sufferers from that acute form of food mania known as starvation, you would probably be astonished at the vagueness of the man's replies. He would, in all likelihood, be totally unable to give any intelligible account whatever of his supposed symptoms. You might get a sort of sinking feeling, or a sort of gnawing feeling, or a sort of all-overish feeling, or some such unscientific gibberish, coupled, very likely, with an unmeaning gesture in the direction of the abdomen. The average hysterical patient could, in 9 cases out of 10, describe her feelings with infinitely more detail and distinctness. And yet nobody in his senses believes that these hysterical sensations or disabilities have any existence out of the diseased brain of the sufferer. The strength of the hunger illusion is conceded. It is not so great, however, as the strength of the hysteria illusion, which may, in some cases, confine a healthy woman to her bed for 20 years. The sufferer from starvation thinks he wants food. The sufferer from hysteria thinks that she has paralysis. The one delusion is as reasonable as the other. But supposing that, out of mistaken kindness, you gratify the horrible and ridiculous longings of the hunger maniac. You give him, say, a steak, that is, a portion of the flesh of the ox. He divides this into portions, masticates it with his teeth, and lets it slip down his throat. He will then tell you that his craving is appeased, that he feels better, and a look of contentment may come into his face, not at all unlike the expression of stupid beatitude which may be seen on the face of the drunkard when his craving has been satisfied. Appeal to the patient, and ask him as a reasonable man to tell you how the swallowing of ox-flesh, partially burned, can lead to content or happiness. He will not tell you. He cannot, nor can anyone else. It is true that medical men, who have their formulas just as priests have their creeds, have written many unintelligible volumes concerning nutrition, assimilation, gastric juice, peptones, proteids, etc., etc. Note again the resemblance between the jargon of medicine and the jargon of theology. But it is not, it is presumed, seriously contended that the average starving man has read these volumes and has been convinced by their arguments that he has mastered in all its detail the intricate and wonderful processes by which somehow or other, confrere the theological mystery, burned ox-flesh is converted into happiness and content, and high thoughts of joy. It is certain that the sufferer from starvation has done nothing of the kind. He is no more able to demonstrate the irrational action he has performed than a poor Catholic is able to demonstrate the sacrifice of the Mass. The starving man who chews beef, the devout man who goes to Mass, are, in plain language, persons who perform actions for which they are unable to give the semblance of a reasonable account. They are in the same class as lunatics, drunkards, and morphomaniacs. Probably it would not be difficult to trace this extraordinary delusion to its origin. At some very early and barbarous period in human history, eating was probably invented as a kind of initiatory rite. It was supposed that he who received the flesh of the ox into his body partook mystically of the ox's strength and endurance. Different animals were added to obtain different qualities, the whole process being no doubt a curious ritual, which it might not be impossible to reconstruct. The same theory pervaded medicine for many ages, and is perhaps not quite extinct even at the present day, and even now some savages believe that to eat the heart of the lion gives courage. It is not difficult to understand that eating, originally a sacrament, became in course of time a habit, and then an apparently irresistible appetite. Ambrose then examined the question of the outworks, on which the doctor had laid a good deal of stress. He had not much difficulty in showing the extreme extravagance and absurdity of all the ceremonial of eating and drinking. It is contended, he wrote, that eating and drinking are customs intimately, nay, most intimately, connected with the body's health, with its very existence. If this were really so, one cannot think that men would have surrounded these actions with a grotesque and elaborate social ritual. A man does not gather his friends round him when he has to undergo a serious operation. He does not send out cards when he intends to take a dose of medicine. It is not even customary to make the bathroom a social center. If eating and drinking be, as it is urged, of vital consequence to bodily health and existence, then they are the intimate concerns of the body, and every consideration of decency demands that such matters be attended to in strict privacy. We have seen that in reality a dinner party is an irrational relic of a forgotten rite, a true superstition, in fact, and on this hypothesis the crazy ceremonial practiced on such an occasion becomes comparatively intelligible. Otherwise, such a function would have no counterpart out of Bedlam, and few within it. Further, let us consider what eating at the present day really implies. No man will pretend that mustard and horseradish are necessary to life. No man can maintain that dishes are rendered more wholesome or nourishing by the addition of elaborate sauces and condiments, or that a jelly sustains and fortifies any the more by being made in an extravagant shape and colored with some bright pigment. If food were taken as a necessary, probably 5 minutes would be sufficient for its consumption. It would be prepared in some soluble and digestible form, and would be swallowed by the bedside, the first thing in the morning and the last thing at night. It would certainly not be served to people dressed in silly costume by ministrants in a sillier. It would not be disguised in all imaginable shapes and colors, concealed by strange flavorings on a board richly draped, decorated like an altar with lights and flowers, while in some cases music is played on a band of instruments. Note how all these circumstances fit in with the theory of a savage rite of initiation. The outworks, then, of eating and drinking are positively maniacal in their irrationality. We may safely conclude, therefore, that the whole system is profoundly unreasonable, absurd, and unjustifiable. It was clear, he showed, that eating and drinking made their chief appeal to barbarous and backward peoples and ages. Children were gluttons. Savages were voracious eaters. In the Middle Ages, people devoured terrible gargantuan banquets, and uncultured and unscientific people in all parts of the world could scarcely think of a festival of any kind without thinking also of enormous meals, washed down by enormous draughts of liquor. In fact, a feast had come to be synonymous with the act of eating and drinking to gross excess. Scientific men were agreed in denouncing such orgies as barbarous and highly injurious to health. Another of the doctor's tests was therefore satisfied. The food habit was indulged in to the fullest extent by the ignorant and childish, and condemned by men of science. Ambrose's case was easiest when he came to the great point of material advantage. As it happened, a term or two before, some tainted meat had been supplied to one of the houses. 2 boys had died, and a considerable number were seriously ill. It was a bad case of ptomaine poisoning. He took this as an example, near at hand, of the horrible dangers of eating and drinking. He worked from this text to the whole question of impurities in food and drink, and showed the high probability that death might lurk literally in every mouthful and in every draught. He made an elaborate list of the hideous and mortal diseases that might be, nay, that were, communicated to the victim of the hunger and thirst mania. Meat of all kinds swarmed with germs of disease. It was killed and stored under the most filthy and dangerous conditions. In its preserved forms, it was usually rotten with gangrene and decay before it was made into the sausage or placed in the tin. He quoted a well-known doctor to the effect that the killing and preparation of meat had made no advance in the direction of sanitation since the Stone Age. He reveled in the description of rotten pork and tuberculous beef. To drink liquor of any kind was, of course, a mere courting of death. There were statistics showing how many thousands of children were carried off annually by milk alone, reckoned by the ignorant and superstitious as the most innocent of fluids. He made, in fact, a little monograph of poisonous adulterations of food and drink, with notes culled from the papers of whole families who had fallen victims to the food and drink habit. Then, of course, there was the larger point of view. It was not difficult to show from various medical authorities that, adulteration apart, the whole matter of diet and drink was in itself highly noxious and prejudicial to health. One great man, for example, pronounced all the alcohols to be poisons, pure and simple, of varying degrees of venom. One might achieve a death of rapid and horrible torture on brandy or gin, or one might choose to linger inefficient and ill for many years, while strength and vitality were sapped by small beer. But he demonstrated that it was of all futilities the most futile to suppose that safety was to be sought in temperance beverages. The vegetarians were able to show the horrible and destructive effects of meat-eating clearly enough. Their case was proven up to the hilt. The carnivorous man was an unhealthy man, a feeble man, and also a moral monster. But on the other hand, the meat-eater could show quite as clearly that the rice-eating Bengalis were a weak-kneed race of chatterers, capable only of showing energy in the perpetration of horrible and fiendish cruelties on defenseless women and children. In fact, it was only too plain that the wickedest actions in the world had been committed by vegetarians. So with drink. Alcohol was deadly, it was true, but there were eminent authorities who declared that tea and coffee were much more deadly, that the continued consumption of these beverages could only lead to the utter ruin of the race in body and mind. As for water, its use had swept away armies and desolated cities. The conclusion was irresistible. So far from the food delusion being a material benefit, it was clearly responsible for more violent and agonizing deaths than all the wars that had been ever waged. It was a more frightful revenge than the yellow hag, the black pest, the plague, the sleeping sickness, and Asiatic cholera, and a more enlightened age would doubtless treat its victims as criminal lunatics. Chapter 2. Ambrose was a good deal amused when he heard of the horror with which his Rabelaisian epistle had been received. He was a little sorry, too, as well as amused. He had forgotten the utter ignorance of literature which characterizes the average schoolmaster, the absolute inability to understand the literary point of view. Ambrose had meant to send his old housemaster an entertaining ludus, in the doctor's phrase, but what Mr. Horbury had received was, to him, a terrible compound of blasphemy against the school ideals and obscenity. It was a pity, but Ambrose Meyrick could never quite understand things. He would have reverenced the high abstraction of the saint, his unwillingness to be disturbed in his vision of great joy by the dust and dirt of earth. He could have appreciated the frame of mind which would turn away from a report of the debates in the House of Commons as an obscene nuisance, but he could not see the average point of view. He always protested that the man who gloated over the scabrous and hideous matter in the daily press, over details which were unspeakably degrading and repulsive, and then subscribed for the suppression of Rabelais and Boccaccio, was nothing more or less than a hypocritical scoundrel, whose escape from utter damnation might perhaps be effected by the power of the eternal compassions, but in no other way. "Look," he said once, "here, in this highly respectable family journal, there is a careful and elaborate account of the career of a hermaphrodite. See, one is not spared the details. How the dear public will revel over it. How they will smack their lips. The men who sent poor old Visitelli to prison for publishing La Terre in English. These men and their sons. But, of course, it is highly for the public interest that minute information about hermaphrodites should be circulated in the press, and journalists, as is well known, are the slaves of the public good. You know how zealously these gentlemen strive to protect the young girl from the contamination of reading licentious literature. It is interesting to see the literary fare which they consider suitable for their innocent young protégée. The girl of the future, carefully instructed in West End scandals, divorce proceedings, and hermaphrodites, will be truly a charming product." Ambrose could never understand, and so he was astonished at the horror which his little jeu d'esprit excited. He has left few notes, and these of the slightest, with respect to his sojourn among the strolling players. It was an odd circumstance which made him think of the stage. A year or so before he left Lupton, the headmaster had conceived the brilliant idea of inviting a company of actors to give a performance of Henry V in the Speech House. The upper forms were studying the play in some disgusting edition proceeding from the highest scholastic sources. Or rather, they were engaged in burying the poetry and the fun and the dramatic action under a load of rubbishy notes, the chief point of which seemed to be that you were to confrere everything with something else. At the same time, the period was being carefully got up, which meant that the boys were busy in digging the pit of their historical ignorance broader and deeper, and in surrounding the pit aforesaid with a gilt fence of names and dates. A few, perhaps, had glanced into the little books and were inclined to think they must have been jolly times, that Harry of England was a sportsman, that it must have been fine to have broken a lance on Crispin Crispinian's day, that Nym and Pistol and Bardolph were almost as good fun as Jack Harkaway. In fact, that here was some rare high stuff. Only it was a pity that the old bounder who wrote it couldn't have put it all into plain decent English that a fellow could read as easily as a novel. They were soon convinced of their error after their form masters had taken them in hand for a couple of weeks. The text was a series of elaborate traps and mines which the notes sprang upon them, traps and mines of dates and facts and names, historical, philological, grammatical traps, all of infinite tedium, all or nearly all leading up to confrere. This word was to be compared with the Gothic form, this with the Frisian, this with the Middle English. This phrase was paralleled with something not a bit like it from Euphues. Name of author, dates of birth and death, date of publication, all duly given. This sentence, with the remark of Bacon's, dates as before. Here the authority of Cotgrave was invoked. There the happy lads found themselves plunged into a consideration of Hooker's ecclesiastical polity. It did not take the masters long to reduce Harry into a disagreeable shadow, draped in dates. Bardolph, Nym, and Pistol became subjects for examination and nothing more. The battle of Agincourt was found out and declared to be a pest and a nuisance. They were all, one might say, permanently fortified against all knowledge or understanding of English history, literature, manners, poetry, and humor for all time, and some of them did very brilliantly in the inevitable examinations. It was in the midst of this agreeable, intelligent, and instructive process that the Hathaway Company paid their visit at the doctor's invitation. The boys welcomed them at the station. The player folk, poor souls, were wary. They had been doing a number of one-night stands at the end of their tour. For the last fortnight they had been worked to death. Their train calls had varied between the hours of 6 and 8. They had partaken of badly prepared and insufficient breakfasts by gaslight, and then had turned out into rainy, wind-swept streets to tramp down to the station where they would find the stage carpenter, the baggage man, and the assistant stage manager who had been getting the scenery on the trucks all night, and had enjoyed some 2 or 3 hours' sleep on the station benches. Then the railway journey, the arrival at some little town, or rather, very often, at some station a mile or so away from the town. They shouldered their baggage and tramped in the muddy road. It was 12 o'clock, perhaps. The matinee was at 2, and it was necessary to find rooms and get something to eat before going to the hall to dress and make up. It is not agreeable, pacing the streets of a strange town where actors are regarded as professional thieves in disguise, knocking at doors in vain, received here with grins of contempt, there with open violence, walking still and walking, finding that the inns and taverns are all mysteriously full, still walking, and wondering whether one will have to leave the question of rooms till the matinee is over. Then the hall, the dressing rooms are usually the places for the display of inventive ingenuity, for there are sometimes no tables and very often no chairs. The cautious stroller always carries his own glass in his basket or bag, or sack, as he prefers calling it. He does not mind standing on a damp stone floor in his bare feet, and drawing on his tights by cautious tugs, preserving his balance the while with long-acquired art. He may have to make up in a dark hole, first cousin to a cellar. He draws out his bit of candle, fixes it somewhere, and with hand-glass in one hand and grease-paint in the other, goes gravely to work. And if he be a good stroller, his make-up is well and carefully done, as if he were in a smart room in a West End theatre, with a dresser at his elbow and 2 movable electric standards on each side of his mirror. Then the show, on the best makeshift of a stage that the staff has been able to arrange. Sometimes it has had to be extended by boards laid on barrels. Sometimes entrances have to be made up a stepladder, and exits are leaps into an apparent void. The footlights are a long series of holes pierced in a gas pipe, and a god from the machine has known what it is to have his deity illumined by the rays of a bicycle lamp. The show over, a villainously cooked chop or steak is enjoyed, and just as the stroller feels that he would like a doze of an hour or 2, it is time to go to the hall and repeat the performance of the afternoon. He gets to sleep somewhere between 12 and 1, and rests till 6 the next morning, and then begins a tomorrow that is the replica of yesterday. The Hathaway Company had enjoyed a fortnight of this routine before their arrival at Lupton. The low comedian, generally a merry fellow, had said gloomily in the morning that, personally, he would prefer a tour conducted by Red Indians, and the heavy man was bilious. His face was yellowish, and his eyes rolled in a threatening fashion. It was not safe to talk to him. They were all tired to death, and felt as if they had not slept for years when they got out at Lupton, after a train journey of some 4 hours. The boys were waiting for them. It was a whole holiday in honor of the event, and the head had relaxed the laws as to bounds. So some 200 of the impetuous lads were ready on the platform, and a shriek of delight and derision arose as the wretched strollers clambered warily out of their carriages. It was better fun than a travelling menagerie. The players fought their way out into the street amidst a torrent of jeers. The men were congratulated on their taste in dress, and indeed some of the poor fellows were shabby enough. One cannot afford to go to Conduit Street on 35 shillings a week for 42 weeks in the year. And one wit raised the shout, "First on the right, third on the left, shortest way to the county jail." But most of the fun was at the expense of the girls, who were certainly not looking their smartest and prettiest. One boy asked in a clear, cold voice, in accents that suggested a haughty patrician lineage, "Do you mean to tell me that anyone pays to see these women?" And there were shrieks of appreciation over Biederstein's ready wit. The boys followed the actors in groups right through the town. The wretched folk could not shake them off, and young Manners had the pluck to pull the back hair of one of the girls. He wanted to see if it was a wig, as he politely explained to the indignant lady. Another lad, more gallant, went up to 2 of the girls who were walking apart, and proposed an amorous rendezvous in the cricket pavilion. Altogether, Lupton that day was a monde en loose amuse. Ambrose heard of it all from the chief jesters. He agreed that it was good sport. The manager of the company complained to the head, who expressed his regret that anything unpleasant had occurred, and Mr. Horbury spoke to Ambrose about the incident. "Of course," he said, "we must disapprove of that kind of thing officially, and if they could have given us any of the fellows' names, they would have had to do lines. High spirits are all very well, but there's a limit to everything. At the same time, you know, I'm not altogether sorry. Boys are such young fools in many ways. There is such a lot of false glamour about the stage. There always is a glamour about the more elaborate forms of loafing. That, as I say, I'm not sorry some of our fellows have had a lesson as to how actors and acting are really regarded by decent Englishmen. I don't think that many Luptonians who are about today will want to go on the stage. Eh, Ambrose?" Mr. Horbury chuckled. He really thought that a useful lesson had been administered. Ambrose had remembered the incident, and when the time came, he made his way at once to the town in which the Hathaways were acting. He was quite clear that there must be a great deal of good in anything which aroused the contempt and derision of all Lupton. Chapter 3. I am afraid, Ambrose notes in one of his books that the golden days of the stage are numbered. One sees more and more surely that the horrible wave of respectability is advancing on the profession, that the old race of workmen with their mysteries and craft receipts, their peculiar jargon, their pride in the art, is dying out. The new generation is nothing to me. An English country gentleman is an excellent type. I admire it with all my heart, but I don't care to see an indifferent imitation of the character being given by a strolling player. How odd it is that in Chaucer one does not see the faintest desire in the clerk of Oxford or the miller to be taken for the knight or the squire. I suppose that the new generation was knocking at the door when I joined Hathaway, but it had not been let in. We were not ashamed of our craft. We were proud of it, and accepted our blue chins as a miller accepts his flowery costume. What a good life it was, in spite of discomforts, of greasy food cooked by slap-cabbage landladies, in spite of rooms that were often very far from cleanliness, in spite of evil-smelling, inconvenient dressing-rooms in insanitary theaters, of wearisome journeys, of rehearsals that began sometimes at 11:30. After the show, we came very near to the ideal life which man was meant to lead. Who can measure the excellent effects of vagabondage, of the continual rolling which keeps the stone clean of moss and lichen? Acting is not a high art, nor a fine art. It is doubtful whether it is really an art at all, but the life of the strolling player is, or was, the nearest approach that this age can make to the life of the wandering craftsman of the Middle Ages. Sometimes I hear, by chance, snatches of old music, and I want to take off my hat. Back I go to the stuffy dressing-room, and the dear scattered faces are reassembled. The drums and trumpets sound from the stage. I am waiting to go on in the wings. The clanking of the armor and the clash of swords sounds in my ear. The stage manager, would he were here, hisses his opinion of my dancing with wonderful eloquence from the prompt corner. It all returns, dear happy life of players errant, purged unconsciously of most of the hideous vices of modern civilization. I take off my hat when I hear the old music, for I think of the old friends and the old days, of the theatre in the meadows by the sacred river, and the song of the nightingales on sweet spring nights. There is no doubt that we may safely hold with Plato his opinion, and safely may we believe that all earthly things are but broken copies and dim lineaments of everlasting realities. Therefore, I hope and trust I shall again be gathered into the true Hathaway company, quae sursum est, which is the purged and exalted image of the lower, which plays for ever a great mystery in the theatre of the meadows of Asphodel, which wanders by the happy streams and drinks from an eternal cup in a high and blissful and everlasting tavern. Ave, cara sodalitas, ave semper. Ambrose stayed a little more than 2 years with the strollers. He sent the address of a solicitor to his uncle, his coming of age, and found when Mr. Horbury sent in his statements that there was a pleasant little sum of money to his credit. Mr. Vaughan consented to stay on at the Wern, and Ambrose, bidding farewell to his companions, sheathing his property sword for the last time, journeyed up to London on a cold, bright day in early spring. Chapter 4. He felt strangely enough as he saw the outer walls of London rising before him, and the train rushed through the suburbs and into the terminus. It was nearly 4 years since he and Nellie had paid the famous visit, and it seemed as if it were such a long while ago. Everything was so changed, within and without. And yet, though there was a keen March wind blowing, and white clouds were fleeting across a slate-blue sky, he almost felt again that hot blast that had welcomed them as they left the station. But it was all over. The curtain had been rung down forever on that scene of his life. The streets were changed. Perhaps, he thought, it was the difference between March and August. But no, it was not so. The London of 4 years ago no longer existed, for him at all events. A new man, he came to a new city. He settled down finally in a pleasant set of rooms in Gray's Inn Square. The windows of his sitting room looked out on the garden, and by the time he took up his residence the leaves were green, and he might have thought himself a dweller in a lodge in a wood if it had not been for the low rumble of traffic from Theobald's Road, which was only silenced in the deepest hours of the night. It was in this place that he sat down and began that long meditation which was henceforth his life. One of his first tasks, it is believed, was to set in order the notes he had made 4 years before in Little Russell Row for the Defence of Taverns, and soon afterwards he wrote his article on The Hidden Mystery, which attracted a certain amount of notice, for accidental rather than essential reasons. It appeared in the pages of a most respectable magazine, a magazine of classic fame which had settled the business of many a young poet far away back in the 30s and 40s. The editor was attracted by Ambrose's style, and as it afterwards appeared, could not have had any very clear understanding of the subject matter. The fact was, Ambrose had been artful. His essay was written on a curious text, the utter blindness of 2 centuries or more to the beauties of Gothic art. He showed how even the draftsmen of the 18th century, with, say, Lincoln Cathedral before their eyes, were utterly unable to draw it correctly, to give any true idea of the Gothic mouldings or tracery. He quoted Smollett on York Minster, Washington Irving on Westminster Abbey. He made a catena of witnesses to the singular fact that for more than 2 centuries men were surrounded by wonderful buildings which, in a true sense, they were absolutely unable to see. He showed, too, that, to a great extent, the same principle worked in literature and in painting. He quoted Dr. Johnson's dictum as to Pope's poetry, his criticism of Lycidas, pointing out the extreme shrewdness, sagacity, and honesty of Johnson's character, and yet the lexicographer thought Lycidas was something very near to rubbish, and Pope's admirably clever verse poetry in its most absolute, perfect, and final form. As for painting, were not the Carraccis highly esteemed, and Giotto, Cimabue, and Botticelli regarded as semi-barbarians? At the same time, he showed that it would never do to write off the 18th century as utterly deficient in all artistic perception, since in the rarest and purest of all the arts it could boast of the greatest of masters. The age of Pergolesi, Handel, Bach, and a vast number of minor musicians who wrote work as charming in its way as the minor poets of the Elizabethan and Caroline periods. This was no age of artistic barbarism, and even in architecture itself, St. Mary le Strand was, of its kind, very near to perfection. But then, on the other hand, what was the attitude of the Augustins and their successors towards nature, scenery, the visible universe generally? Clearly, it was an attitude of men blinded, stupefied, befogged. The trees and streams of the great Berkeley, illustrious among philosophers, a spiritual thinker, if there ever was one, were taken out of Plato's dialogues. The poets went to Hampton Court Gardens and to the famous maze for nature. They called the wood a bosky shade, and Johnson and Boswell, who found Greenwich Park much too countrified for their taste, were interested in the wild Hebrides as one is interested in grotesque oddities from the South Sea Islands. And, to take another region of the soul, nearly all of these men, most of them acute and intelligent in a high degree, were firmly convinced that the blessings of the Reformation were so clear, palpable, and certain that there was no room for argument on the matter. Wharton certainly hinted that the effect on the arts was not of the best. Johnson, probably for sport, took the unpopular side in talking to Boswell, but in the general opinion of the cultured, the matter was as clearly settled as the result of adding 2 and 2. Popery was wholly wrong. Protestantism was entirely right. It seemed, then, to follow from all these instances that whole generations of men, no more stupid and ignorant than their ancestors or successors, might be absolutely blinded as to matters that were, literally and physically, before their eyes. There could hardly be more conspicuous objects than Lincoln Cathedral, a forest, or a mountain. Beauties could scarcely be more clearly evoked and displayed than the beauties of Lycidas. And many of the men thus blind on certain points were of very exceptional ability and acuteness on other matters, and even on artistic matters. It was as if a man walked through a wood, admiring the beauty of the oak, and at the same moment wondering why an all-wise Creator had made the grotesque ugliness of the ash and the beech and the yew. Therefore Ambrose proceeded, since intelligent and thoughtful and sagacious men were obviously blind as to such obvious and manifest beauty as that displayed in visible nature, Gothic architecture, Elizabethan and Caroline poetry, and Catholic ritual. Is it not highly probable that men no less intelligent and sagacious are at the present moment blind as to certain matters which may not be so obvious, which, it should rather be said, seem to us not so obvious? Is it not possible that while we look down on the Augustines with pitying superiority, we ourselves may be sunken in darkness on matters infinitely more vital and important than the subjects on which they displayed so invincible an ignorance? This may be difficult to realize. To us, the beauty of Lincoln Cathedral, of Lycidas, of the great spectacle of the visible world, of early Italian art, is so clear and so incontestable that we could as readily contradict the axioms of Euclid or the laws of logic as the presence of beauty in these things. But, after all, que scavons nous? Unless we take up the position that we have attained to final perfection, that we have surpassed all the wisdom of the wise, all the art of all artists, all the visions of all seers, that compared with us all precedent humanity is in all things, as a schoolboy in the multiplication table to Sir Isaac Newton, that the universal goal is attained, the race run and won forever, unless we take up this slightly ridiculous and monstrous position, we must confess that there is a high probability, at all events, that we, in our turn, are blind to many sights, deaf to many sounds, insensitive to many wonders, ignorant of many mysteries. Then Ambrose went on to show the probability of this thesis by many analogies, drawn from things of mind and of matter. He instanced the laws of logical science, latent in man's discourse from the beginning of speech, and yet not clearly perceived nor demonstrated till the day of Aristotle. Here was a mystery or magistry that had been visible and yet invisible for countless ages, that had been before the intellectual eye of countless myriads, day after day, hour after hour. The veriest savage who used stone arrows to shoot prehistoric game must have been familiar with Barbara and Celerin, and yet he knew it not, though he won his dinner and his life by this knowledge that was concealed from himself. The analogies were indeed innumerable. How many apples had fallen before the law of gravitation was enunciated? How often had the power of steam been perceived before the obvious application was disclosed? And man had gazed at the earth and sky, at the clouds and the woods, the sea and the rivers, for how many ages before the mystery and the beauty of the world were really manifested in the days of Coleridge, Wordsworth, and Turner. At this point he paused for a while in his main argument to follow a curious byway of thought. How far, he asked, were we to suppose that much that was not expressed was still felt or experienced? Suppressed, perhaps, out of deference to convention or from fear of consequences. Here was an obscure point which seemed to invite an endless inquiry, on which it was impossible to dogmatize. For instance, you might investigate the marriage customs of some tribe more or less primitive. You might satisfy yourself that to all intents and purposes, marriage and giving in marriage in the tribe in question were as prosaic as much a matter of business as pig-dealing in Wiltshire. And yet, from the heart of this race of chatterers in women, there might surge up a burst of song that expressed all the passion of love. In a sense, the courtship of Portia by Bassanio was a squalid fortune hunt. Still, there were lines that spoke nobly of the latens deitas. Perhaps there were many men of the 18th century who were thrilled to the heart by the ineffable mystery and beauty of the Gothic work, only they were ashamed to confess it, to write themselves down as lovers of ignorance and barbarism in art. And it was hardly conceivable that the heart of men had not been stained by the awe and wonder of the world till about 1790, the glory of dawn and sunset, the terror and splendor of mountains and seas, the delight of the woods in summer, the sweetness and the incantation of scented nights. These things could not have been wholly without witnesses. It could not have been permitted that so many thousands of years should pass before the hieroglyphic speech of the world to the soul was in a measure deciphered. No doubt there were hints of this universal mystery written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin, and still they were but hints, and undoubtedly the full expression, or rather the approximately full expression, had been reserved to a comparatively late date. And yet, how many people since the foundation of the world had felt all this, all that Coleridge and Wordsworth, Keats and Tennyson had written and had lacked words or courage to express it? He wondered how much of previous treasure we had lost, how much we were still losing, from this lack of courage, from this fear of telling the great incredible dreams which apparently contradict sense and experience, science and convention, reason itself, and yet are perfect wisdom and beauty. It seemed probable enough that this loss had been, was, and would be huge enough. He noted the fierce, irrational intolerance that was ready to be called out at any moment by the slightest novelty, by the faintest departure from the most external of the conventions, more especially when the new departure moved towards truth and beauty. Alexander Pope and the people of his tribe had but little to fear, since the lower part of every man is always in sympathy with clever observations of common externals expressed in more or less clear and witty phrases, and above all with trite moralizings. As has been well said, Tate and Brady were in the longships that bore Hengist and Horsa, and it might have been said, with equal truth, that Tet and Brady followed the Cymry to the Isle of Britain from the land of summer. In every age, in every race, there was a great majority ready and anxious to applaud such gems as the proper study of mankind is man. One craftsman hates another. The unexpected often happens, as genuine pearls of poetry and wisdom, and those who excelled in this manner need fear no terrors or persecutions. But when the turn of the wheel came, when a man saw the heavens opened, and it said so, then let him beware, for Professor Wilson, Mr. Lockhart, and Dr. McGinn were not slow to deal with such a one as this. It seemed probable, then, that human nature being what it is, and always has been, anxious in the main for an easy time in things of the body or things of the mind, averse from incurring opposition and dislike, desirous, in the popular phrase, to live and let live, it was probable that many who could have spoken, have kept silence, were still keeping silence. Poe had an interesting speculation as to the fate of transcendent greatness in vision. He thought that it had been rewarded for the most part by the scaffold and the madhouse, but this was doubtful. With contempt and neglect, and then with a spurious post-mortem fame, were the truer version of the facts. It was interesting to note, by the way, how in some cases there had been a kind of composition. Tennyson had no doubt compounded for the Fatima by the May Queen and Enoch Arden. The verities had been passed unchallenged under the cloak of the domesticities. In like manner, Poe, a great seer as well as a great artist, was accorded a sort of contemptuous toleration as the author of The Bells and the Raven. He returned after this digression to the central point of his argument. the probability of an all but universal ignorance or blindness as to things of the very highest moment. He suggested further that it was even probable that there might be one central truth, one eternal beauty, one great word that had not been lost, at least in time, because it had never been found. A secret of secrets, a master mystery, a key opening the door of the shut palace of the king. Taking this as his hypothesis, he imagined this one truth as everywhere present, everywhere visible, everywhere known, and yet all unknown. It might perhaps be spoken of under the most varied symbolisms. It might be manifested under the most diverse forms. It might sometimes be so degraded in evil use as to appear more pertinent to devilry than divinity. Or again, it might be like some ingenious puzzle in its manifestation, as if one were to conceive, for example, some picture divided into minute portions, and these strewn at random on a table. It might be very difficult to perceive any relation between the parts. It might not appear that they were parts at all. It might be the work of a great imagination to collect the bright fragments together and set them in their true order, so that the great and beautiful whole should appear. Better still, he said, conceive a stained glass window taken to pieces, bit by bit from its leads, and the irregular red and green and blue and golden morsels put in a basket and given to a savage. It is likely enough that the black fellow would be delighted with the fragments as ornaments of a new kind, but how hard it would be for him to set the golden pieces together and make of them the saint's aureole. In all likelihood, most of the glass would find its way to the swamp, there to give greater worship to the fetish deity. He went on in this ingenious and elaborate vein, conjecturing the existence of this great master mystery, the mainspring and the source of all being, all joy, all savour, and all delight, the ens unum in diversis, that which gives glory to the dawn and a melody to concordant sounds, sweetness to the rose, magic to the poem, wonder to the romance, potent also and all prevailing in the highest secrets of life and death. The article appeared, as has been said, in a magazine of the highest respectability. It was a good deal noticed and commented on as a passionate and eloquent appeal for the appreciation of beauty in common things. It was only some year or two later, when Ambrose had published his first story, the Rosa Mundi, that people began to put two and two together, and it was generally felt that his work was not quite nice. It must not be imagined that the idea for which he worked was at all understood, but in certain instances there were I's in the article and dots in the story, and it would have been quite difficult not to put the one on the other. Such was the beginning of a long and austere career, devoted to a great and mystic end. Of course, Ambrose was misunderstood, often laughed at, occasionally abused, but he always maintained that his ways were made far too pleasant for him. He deplored the soft, indifferent age in which he labored, which could only provide a quarter column of ill-tempered chaff for the stones and fires of braver times. Indeed, the ill-temper and the chaff were often missing. His reviewers told him he was a clever fellow, and only asked, much more in sorrow than in anger, why he did not devote his talents to simple, healthy themes of domestic interest. It is not probable that the end will ever be clearly understood. The few documents that are available seem to leave the whole matter in a state of conjecture, and it has only been possible to surmise the objects of the last wonderful journey after a very careful and minute reading of Ambrose's notebooks and journals, in which certain hints and things half said seem to supply a certain clue to a strange adventure. So far as can be gathered, then, it appears probable that old Cradock, in handing over to Ambrose the blessed cup of Tylosant, had delivered also a certain charge concerning the relic, and it may well be that the final removal of the Sangreal in the romances owes its existence to traditions and rumors of the charge in question. However this may be, it is practically certain that Ambrose, when he went to the East, took with him the holy vessel, and bestowed it in safe custody in the place to which he had been directed, and perhaps its splendor and glories will never more be seen by mortal eyes. The Kurds crucified him on a tree that stands just without the village where he was staying. They descended on the Christian people, descended in their usual fashion. Some of these fled, some hid themselves, many were given to torture and cruel death. One of them, who was hidden, told how he saw the stranger Ambrosian brought out, and how they put before him the image of the crucified, that he might spit upon it and trample it under his feet. But he kissed the icon with great joy and penitence and devotion. So they bore him to the tree and nailed him there, and after he had hung some hours, the Kurds, enraged, as it was said, by the delight and rapture that shone on his face, killed him with their spears. In this manner did Ambrose Meyrick gain red martyrdom, and achieve the most glorious quest and adventure of the Sangreal.